And that's Metallica from 1983. Seek and Destroy. That's why I open this the show now. Going on 3 years, I've been opening up with that show because of that caption, Seek and Destroy. What are we doing here? Essentially, we're seeking out to destroy the corruption. Initially, when I started the show, going on 4 years now, when I started the show, I was simply researching to disclose events in corporate life, political life that were corrupt. What I witnessed in 2016 in Miami Beach was total puppetry, corruption in the local government, state government, handed down by the CDC. Regarding the Zika virus, and now, lo and behold, we have another pandemic, coronavirus pandemic, and this time the guise of something called the Covid19. So anyway, without further ado, folks, bringing on today's initial guest, because I'll be following this up with another episode, and that'll be with Paul Preston, who is organizing a new state. That's right, he's organizing a new state. That is a new California, and his movement is very serious. So we'll be talking to him in about an hour, but right now we're going to open up with the author of a book called COVID-19 Lockdowns on Trial. Michael Betrus will be joining us in a moment. April 17th in Oklahoma, Thrive. Clay Clark will be hosting an event that will have a number of important American figures, including Dr. Simone Gold, who's got a JD from Stanford and an MD from the University of Chicago. Also, Sidney Powell will be speaking at that event. And hear what her kind of challenges she faced in regards to trying to get recounts. Pretty basic concept in any kind of democratic movement. And General Flynn. Those are just three names that stand out to me. Of course, there's Andy Wakefield. There's others that will be speaking at that event. So Thrive's a Thrive event. Definitely look into that. Perhaps it'll be streaming online. I do not know. Again, that's April 17th. And later in the month of April, this program will be hosting U.S. Army Major General, former, retired now, Mary Kay Eder. We've got a number of great developments coming down the pipeline here, as always, on Discussions of Truth, and I exhort you to definitely contribute to the program at iantrottier.com. That's IANTROTTIER.com. You can find a list of I think all my past guests there, including at anchor.fm. Past episodes, including Charlotte Iserbit, Paul Craig Roberts. It's a quite extensive list, and the discussions are quite compelling. So, without any further ado, again, as I mentioned, calling in the author today of COVID-19, his second edition, Lockdowns on Trial, Michael Betrus. Let's bring him in right now via Skype. Call him in right now, folks. Seek and Destroy. Okay, Michael Betrus. Lockdowns on Trial.
Hello?
Yes, Michael. Ian Trottier here.
Hi, Ian. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Welcome to Discussions of Truth. It's nice to have you on the program, and glad we connected. Michael,
me too.
Yeah, thanks. Michael, take a moment here, if you would, and introduce yourself to listeners.
Well, my name is Michael Betrus. I have written a book, Covid-19 Lockdowns on Trial. The first edition was last spring, and I updated it over the winter. And it's really just a proportionate response or discussion about COVID-19 and are the lockdowns the appropriate response to this.
Great. So you've got an extensive kind of a chapter summary here, and I like where you're going with a lot of this. In your view, what a lockdown is. A lockdown is quite a movement on a social scale. You've got a governmental body, obviously, that is locking down masses of people. It's seen its challenges, and it's certainly seen its controversies and arguments. In your view, what is a lockdown, and why is it necessary from a government standpoint?
Well, so the initial model that came out about a year ago was from the Imperial College in London. And so they predicted, due to COVID-19, that in a worst-case scenario, we would have a 9-fold shortfall in hospital capacity. That's a worst case. And in our best case, it was going to be a 3-fold shortfall. And so the purpose of the lockdown really wasn't to get to really what's discussed now is sort of the zero COVID environment where we just need to do anything we can to get it down to zero, and we're not opening up or loosening restrictions in some states until then. The idea then, which was reasonable if you believe the model, is we're going to overwhelm hospitals, so we need to stream this thing out so not everybody gets infected at once. That's a reasonable assumption. Now, the inputs of that never made sense, because if you look at the cruise ship data, which was the best scientific experiment, really, still, even today, it's the best experiment we had. 2 do-nothing scenarios, 7,400 people exposed. We had 10 people die on the cruise ships, and according to the Imperial College model, which I was one of the first ones to really work this up, we should have had 155 deaths on those 2 cruise ships, and we had 10. So the model never made sense. But if you believed the model, you could believe that lockdowns would be appropriate, because if you do limit person-to-person contact, you will have some effect on all this. What we've seen in America is such a prolonged mitigation here. If you look at playbooks from the CDC and the WHO before COVID, they thought in an environment for the COVID-19 would be a Category 2 or Class 2 pandemic. You would see schools closed for 4 weeks and some large events canceled, and encouraged social distancing, where you might see split shifts at work and things like that. And that was it. That was all they recommended for a pandemic of this level. The fact that we've got kids out of school for a year and a half, will end up a year and a half, it's just unfathomable. Closing restaurants, those were things that were never discussed in the playbooks of the WHO and the CDC before COVID, and yet we got some momentum going, and the public has been very afraid. I mean, they're still very afraid. We've embraced, and those playbooks said maybe only the sick and symptomatic should wear masks in public, and that should be optional, but strongly encouraged. Now we've got mask mandates all over, and even in the states, I live in Texas, where we no longer have a mask mandate, people still wear them all the time. Retailers require them in most cases, and mask adoption, mask wearing is still very, very high in Texas.
Wow. So you're a Texan, and I was recently in Texas. I was in Houston. You may know, but I'm currently in Florida. Texas is really I like how the governor Abbott has stood very strong to the current administration, and Texas, for listeners, I'm sure many know. I mean, that there's the kind of the motto, the Texas motto, don't mess with Texas. And Texans are very, very, very independently thinking, more so than perhaps other states. You open up the book by comparing the Spanish flu, which your research in the book reveals that it claimed 55 million lives. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. What are some of the comparisons here with the Spanish flu? Has the media, has current day media perhaps dramatized this COVID-19 situation compared to what the world saw in 1918 with the Spanish flu?
Yeah, they're completely incomparable. The Spanish flu, for one thing, you didn't have treatments then, so you didn't have antibiotics. You couldn't treat infections that were prompted or instigated by the Spanish flu, and so you lost a lot of lives because of treatments then. But in today's population, we would have lost 1.8 million people. The actual number of COVID deaths is probably closer to 70% of the reported total, so that's still a very real number. We're probably at 350,000 actual COVID-19 deaths. I lost a family member in a care facility. I'm not minimizing that. But here's the real difference, Ian, is when you look at the Spanish flu and when you look at the pandemic planning of the CDC and the WHO, they predicted or expected kids would be the number one transmitters, like they are the flu. Kids are the number one transmitters of the flu every year. Any parent will know that. Parents of kids tend to get sicker than adults that don't have kids.
Sure, okay.
And so if there's one blessing, if there's one good thing COVID-19 gave us, is kids really aren't effective transmitters of this, nor are they really at risk. And so if you look at the Spanish flu, you sort of had this three age population segment that was at risk. One was very young kids, very young, under five and under. Then you had adults, mostly males, 20 to 40 was a huge population segment that was at risk to COVID. That's why it kind of wiped out World War I. And then it takes a break, and then the very elderly were very susceptible. COVID-19 isn't really like that. If you look at people under 65, if you just look at to be a pandemic, to qualify, you've got to have 7.3%, I think, of deaths attributed to this one cause. If you looked at the population in America under 65, we wouldn't even know we were in a pandemic. There's been no statistical pandemic for people under 65. There's been a huge pandemic for people over 65. And so when we look at doing these one-size-fits-all lockdowns across the entire population, when the entire population is not at statistical risk, kids, we've lost basically one life per million kids in America to COVID-19 after a year. You know, we've lost thousands, tens of thousands of elderly people per million, right? So, the idea of locking down and keeping kids out of class, by the way, this applies to teachers too. Teachers would be at very, very, not at a pandemic level risk at all. Teaching is a young population, median age is 41, 90% of them are not in at-risk categories. So it's really what's this proportionate response? Like we've kind of gone off the rails on science because this is nothing like the Spanish flu. This is a very identifiable segment of the population at risk, very elderly or people with known 3 to 4 comorbidities.
Now, your book is loaded with great quotes. What is your, and I want listeners to again, Michael's book is available on Amazon. You can purchase it right now, should you like. And again, the title is COVID-19 Lockdowns on Trial. What is your thought, Michael? It sounds like you're incredibly articulate, very well spoken. You're very well researched on this. What is your opinion, Michael, with Dr. Fauci?
So I think Dr. Fauci in no way is a public health expert. Dr. Fauci is sort of a one-dimensional infectious disease, let's call him an expert, and he's sort of got a zero mindset. So here's Dr. Fauci. Imagine it's 9/11, and you've got President Bush sitting around right after 9/11 with a bunch of generals, and they know that Al-Qaeda is hiding out under the protection of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And so Bush is asking, hey, all these different generals, there might be 15 in there, like, what do you think we should do? And let's say General Scott Atlas raises his hand and says, I think we should send a SEAL team in and be very surgical about our approach to get the bad guys. And it might take a little longer, but that's what we should do. And then you've got General Fauci who raises his hand and says, no, I think we should just drop 8 or 9 nuclear bombs all across Afghanistan. That's sure to wipe out the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And then General Atlas, if you know who Scott Atlas is, says, well, won't that cause a lot of collateral damage when we only are going after a few people? And General Fauci would say, no, that's not the point. The point is we need to eradicate them, and we need to be sure about it. And so any other collateral damages don't matter. This is only about meeting our objective. That's who Dr. Fauci is. I'm not criticizing him personally. I'm just saying he's a zero COVID guy. And there's lots of things that are about public health, right? Education, psychology, just thousands of untreated medical ailments. I mean, just some things that happened during the lockdowns, which will end up losing more life years than COVID-19. We lost like 46% of our 6 most common cancers didn't get diagnosed. 650,000 cancer patients missed treatments because they locked down hospitals. Meanwhile, hospitals, Ian, were empty everywhere of COVID patients except for about 4 to 6 weeks when each wave hit. In other words, there's 2 parts to take away from this. One, for people under 65, there really was no pandemic. I'm not minimizing it to the people over that because I've got parents that are 89 and I've kept them under very close wraps for years. So I'm a believer in COVID. But it's, again, these lockdowns. So you've got this elderly population that needs to be insulated. But you've got 50 million kids that have been out of class. 200,000 child abuse cases that have popped up. Thousands of normal, what would be diagnosed cancer situations that have gone undiagnosed. I mean, again, hospitals were empty everywhere except when the wave hit each community for about 4 to 6 weeks. People stayed away from hospitals. They're still staying away. That's very, very damaging. When you look at what's happening in New Zealand right now, they've sort of squashed the curve, right? They've had very, very rigid lockdowns. They're fortunate to be an island nation. If you read any news right now, their hospitals are overwhelmed. They're slammed right now. Why? Because people stayed away from getting normal treatments for months, like up to a year. So we've just done a huge disservice by just taking such extreme measures to this when it just didn't really warrant that.
Is it possible that so this has clearly become a political issue in many ways, it seems. What seemed to be a health issue became a political issue. Is it possible that the politicians in the United States have overreacted based off of a pressure, perhaps, or an influence from the outside, be it World Health Organizations or, as you speak of in your book, Oxford University or Imperial College?
I'd say really where this all stems from is polling and media pressure. The media has done a very inept job at reporting on some of the stuff that I mentioned, right? I'm no COVID denier, but the media has done a very poor job of educating exactly, kind of what's been happening and sort of the balance of both who's at risk and what's happening with COVID, but all these lockdown consequences. And so what you've got polling that was just like over the holidays, right? It came out and at a Gallup poll, only 3% of Democrats wanted the country to go back to normal, and only 54% of Republicans, which means if you weight that, 2/3 of the country didn't want to go back to normal. Why? Because they're afraid. Why do people wear masks when they walk around outside?
Yeah.
Which is just the most insane thing ever. It's not like SARS-CoV-2 viruses are flowing around like pollen in the air, but people wear masks outside when they're by themselves. Why? Because they're afraid. And so when you've got polling like that, the governors have a green light. They're not under political pressure, so they can the only scorecard that matters is zero COVID, right? It doesn't matter. That's why you've got governors like Ron DeSantis and Kristi Noem, and now Governor Abbott here, that are under a lot of media pressure because the media is like, hey, you can't do that. We've got to get to a zero COVID thing, and they're not reporting on, hey, you know what? If lockdowns work, why haven't the states with the strictest lockdowns done better? There's no statistical or data correlation between the states or countries that lock down the hardest with having better results, with the exception of Australia and New Zealand. And I'm going to argue they've got homogenous populations. They don't have obese populations, and they're island nations. It is a lot easier to contain something like that.
Sure.
It's like taking the state of Michigan or the state of Florida or something. Florida's too big though, and then making it an island nation. You could control it a little bit more. You've got to compare the U.S. to Europe, to the whole EU. You just can't do that. What they did accomplished in New Zealand, and they've got a lot of collateral fallout. Huge recession going on in New Zealand right now, one of the worst in the world.
So, and of course, when you're talking about isolating on an island, then of course bringing up some of these cases that you talk about, and you actually open your book about talking about a cruise ship that leaving Oakland. I'm assuming that's California. I'm not sure, but Michael, then if the media has so bombarded us to think in one way, and the statistics, for instance, the numbers being reported, I think you threw out something. I remember you said about 10 minutes ago that 70% of the reported deaths are likely inaccurate. I remember exactly what you just said, but you alluded to
70% are. So about 70%, based on data points we've seen from Iowa, North Dakota, Miami, and then some death certificate matching. About 70% of the reported cases and hospitalizations and deaths. We'll forget cases for just a second, but hospitalizations and deaths are real. That it doesn't mean that there's fraud going on. They're playing by the rules. If somebody tests positive or they've got COVID-like symptoms, hospitals are able to count them and get rewarded for that or get some extra compensation, and they get counted as a death. That they're playing by the rules. There's no fraud going on. It's just that if you really want to understand what's happening, it's about 70% of the actual reported numbers.
So we'll take that and we'll say, hey, is the media therefore should Americans be looking at their media as saying, hey, wait a second, even though we've got these two different sides of the spectrum, it sounds like you turn on Fox and they're very right wing, and then you turn on MSNBC and they're very left wing. Is the American media, have we let it go too far? Is there freedom in press? Is that an issue, do you think?
Well, there's no doubt that there's conservative media has been anti-lockdown very staunchly for several months, and the primetime reporters on Fox for a full year now, and there's no doubt that some of the liberal media has been very panic porn oriented, both in print. When you look at the Washington Post, New York Times, but even they've done some quality reporting on the problem with what's happening in schools. What we've really been absent is some critical thinking on this, and very few people, Ian, do their independent research. And what I'd say further is, you can't, early on in the pandemic, the only place that you could get reality data was on Twitter. So the only people that were actually coming up with real reality data around sort of contextualizing all this, it wasn't on the news. It was originating on Twitter with think tank people. Well, you had Alex Berenson, who's really, kind of led that effort, and you had a handful of other people on Twitter that were crunching data like crazy, and that became the original, and still is today, the original source of almost all reality data that's been out there. You can trace almost all reality data back to 20 or 30 people. It's really interesting.
We've got a guy coming up following you, and he's working on a movement actually to create a new state. And it's interesting because you're talking about Twitter, and that organization that he represents has recently been suspended from Twitter. Do you think that we have an issue with censorship? I mean, whether he was liked or not, we had a sitting president of the United States in the Oval Office that was completely deplatformed. What do you think about that? Is that an issue?
Well, I'll say on the COVID topic and not get too far into the president or politics, but what we do see is on Facebook and on Twitter is a censorship by the people, the people that are working at those organizations, whether they do it manually or with their logarithms, where they've really shut down. People like me, people that have opinions that have shared sort of contextualized data on this, and Twitter's downright blocked them and canceled their accounts. Facebook's done the same. YouTube has also done that. YouTube has blocked out the Great Barrington Declaration doctors. These are really, really smart people. Whether you agree with them or not, there's no way you could listen to an interview with the Great Barrington Declaration docs and not think these guys are super smart. And so when you see, some people that know less about this than me that are arbitrarily saying, hey, if you're not part of the CDC guideline, we aren't going to allow your information to get out there. I just wrote an article out there on rationalground.com called "The CDC Jumps the Shark," and I cited in very, very, a lot of detail around studies that the CDC released that were simply bogus. I mean, and I was very clear. Like, this is a very lengthy article and analysis, and so we need counter opinions and thoughts to this, and there's a lot of really smart people out there that don't work for the CDC, that have great insight, and yes, they have been censored.
So now let's get into vaccines. Is this something that you personally? Well, maybe you don't have to answer that question. Maybe it's a little too close for comfort. What's your opinion on the vaccines? We've got the Moderna vaccine. We've got the Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer. We've got these various companies now that have rushed to get a vaccine out.
Right.
And some people are saying, hey, I'm taking the second dose of this and I'm getting sick. We've got 2 doses from one company and then another company is 1 dose. What do you think about the vaccines?
My general feeling is if you're in an at-risk category, you should take the vaccine.
Yeah.
My parents took it. Again, they're 89 years old in Detroit. They took it. I encouraged that. I kind of wanted them to wait for the Johnson & Johnson, but they took the Moderna, the 2-dose.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have had side effects from both Pfizer and Moderna's second dose. And we've had serious side effects, about 1 in 10,000 or so, where somebody got really sick or hospitalized or perhaps died. But look, I mean, if you're in an at-risk category, your risks are lower of getting seriously ill or losing your life. They're lower with the vaccine than they are COVID. For my purposes, I'm healthy, I'm fit, and so I'm not really at risk. My son is also like that. He got COVID. He and all his roommates at college got COVID last month, and they're fine. And I'm waiting for the J&J, so I would take that. But I'm generally speaking, I'm pro-vax. I'm not pro, like, hey, you need to show proof of this to go back to school, like Rutgers is requiring.
Right.
I mean, college kids are statistically at zero risk, and so are most instructors. Requiring college kids or K through 12 to be vaccinated is, I mean, I'm not saying it's a human rights crime like keeping them out of school, but it's insane. But for someone like me, I'll take the vax. I'll take the J&J when I can get it, and I'm supportive of that. I think that they've probably had an impact. That combined with natural herd immunity, and seasonality. That's why we're seeing this thing. It's disappeared. The pandemic, as we knew it, is over.
Wow. Okay, that's a strong statement because we've got now our current president even having been vaccinated in January, he's still wearing 2 masks. How do we move forward? Go ahead.
Ian, I mean, you heard, if you might have seen, Rand Paul framed it up best when he was having a discussion with Dr. Fauci last week. But all that's theater, right? The people that are anti-vaxxers, they're the people that say that you can't do anything after you're vaccinated or you have to wear masks, right? I mean, if you believe in the vaccines, you're done. I mean, you take the vax, you get your second, you can, if you need a follow-up test, whatever, to show what your antibody resistance is, but we're done. I think the question is, at what number do we just open everything up and do what Texas has done and lift all restrictions? Nationally, we're at 3% hospitalizations for COVID. What number works? You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I absolutely. Now, you throw out a lot of data in your book regarding unemployment. Tell listeners a little about how the unemployment. I mean, look, Michael, I can't fathom the fact that now you talk about the CARES Act as well. We've now had 2 rounds of stimulus. Yet, my argument here, Michael, and we have to get into this, but my argument is, as a country, a federally run country, we have a $28 trillion debt. Yet we're handing out. The government is handing out these these care relief packages, these stimulus checks.
Crazy.
Where's the money coming from? We don't have to get into that, but talk about a little bit about unemployment and how this COVID-19 pandemic has affected that, and what you've learned from that.
Well, so my big hot button since August has really been schools, right? I mean, it's the most obvious, glaring screw up that we made. That combined with eliminating what they call non-essential activity, surgeries in hospitals, right? These aren't facelifts, right? These are important surgeries that people couldn't get for months.
Wow.
So but what started me on it was unemployment, because I'd written a lot of business books published by McGraw-Hill prior to this, and so when we hit 40 million people unemployed, that is what triggered me to start writing the book about it. I was so ticked off about it because it just didn't feel like it was appropriate or proportionate. And what's crazy is where COVID-19 has been, it's sort of preyed on the physically frail, the elderly, or people with underlying conditions. Right. The lockdowns have really preyed on the socially and economically frail, right? I mean, if you're, this has been an annoyance. Let's say if you have a 2-income household and you didn't lose your job and parents are working from home, and kids are home and all, but if you make decent money, you're able to bridge that. You might have, smart parents that can help, or they have the money to pay for tutoring. I can see that all over my neighborhood. Next door, people are hiring tutors like crazy to bridge this. But if you're a single-parent household, right, and you lost your job, you might not have the electronic resources to sort of bridge this. Those are, the socially and economically frail. The lockdowns have been merciless on them. You just never hear that talked about. Occasionally, but it just doesn't make the headlines. If it did, if the media was putting pressure on that, the lockdowns, kids would be in class.
Yeah, and I think that jobs. I mean, this is very interesting, isn't it? Because during this time period, now we've seen an explosion. We've seen an explosion from Jeff Bezos and the Amazon company, right? And some of these delivery companies or have grown quite a bit because people have been isolated to their houses. What are you seeing in education? Look, for instance, and again, not to paint with too broad of a stroke, but in the National Basketball Association, the local team here to Miami, and again, this is in education, but I'm trying to bridge a gap here if we can. The American Airlines Arena has now said that it will have a section for vaccinated people, and those are some of the best tickets in the house. So essentially, without looking into that further, they're saying, hey, once you get vaccinated, then you're going to have, you'll be in your own section. You won't have to worry about the people that aren't vaccinated, and you'll have some great. What are you seeing in regards to, you say you have a son, and then you talked about Rutgers. What are you seeing in regards to the education system, regardless of the level? What is happening here, and how do we move forward, Michael? How do we move forward? Is this an issue of nobody goes back to normal until everyone is vaccinated, or will there be some type of segregating happening? What do you see in that regard?
Well, what I see and what my idealism on what we should do, probably two different things. Like, so again, if I were running this, if I could run this, kids would be in school face to face, short of having an underlying condition, and you could make a decent argument. There's 4% of all students have elderly people living with them. You can make an argument we do a workaround for them, but these aren't, you can't do a large population brush for, small percentages of, what I call outliers. People need to get back to normal, right? And make some personal choices, right? I mean, if you were vulnerable, you should still, until once you're vaccinated, I'd say live normal. But I mean, you should keep a low profile. But everybody else should have the opportunity to go back. Putting vaccination restrictions on, or let's say rewards for people that have been vaccinated. The one thing that really irks me is we've not given any credence to natural immunity, right? We've probably had 150 to 200 million people that have been infected naturally, and we're encouraging them to get vaccinated, and we discount the fact that they've had it. Having the disease probably gives you better immunity. The jury's out, but probably, based on history, would give you better immunity than the vaccinations, particularly the RNAs. And then what we're seeing is a study just came out a few days ago that if you've had COVID and you get the RNA vaccinations, after the second vax, you've got less immunity than you had before you got any of the vaccinations. So we're learning a lot as this all goes. But a lot of this is just momentum, right? It's just momentum around, you've got businesses. I guarantee you, like you go into, you look at all these businesses that are requiring masks in places like Florida or Texas that don't require them at the state level. They probably don't believe, masks just haven't worked, right? There's not a data point in the world that shows wear a mask and you've got continued suppression in a community. That just doesn't exist. If it did, I'd write a book about why we should wear masks. And I'm not being sarcastic, I would.
Right.
I didn't come into this with any predisposition about politics. You wouldn't even know who I voted for by reading my book. I just looked at the data, and it's what's in front of you. So I don't know where we're going to go with vaccinations. We can't really go anywhere until they're FDA approved. And so whether that happens this year or next year, I think it's going to end up kind of a moot point because we're going to have so much natural and vaccinated immunity that COVID is going to recede into a flu type of impact on society going forward.
You talk about Dr. J. Bhattacharya, Stanford study, 0.1 to 0.2 percent fatality rate. We frequently hear that this COVID-19 has a 98% non-fatality, 98 non-fatality. Some of these things have gotten so stretched and so dramatized.
Hold on, Ian. Just to stress this point, all these little percentages kind of make a difference. We're probably at the survival rate of COVID overall is probably about 99.75.
Wow.
So if you kind of figure we've had, and so like no one thinks that like the 30 million or whatever the official number is of cases is the real number. Nobody. The WHO estimated it was in September. It was 17 times higher than what's reported. The CDC said maybe 7 times higher. So whatever that number is, let's just say it's 150 to 200 million people.
Yeah.
If you consider that number of infections and the number of deaths, we're at about a 99.75 percent survival rate. That's decent. That's decent. That's class 2 pandemic. And we know who's at risk, right? Kids are 1 in a million. Hey, let me put this a different way. 15 times more kids died in car accidents last year, according to the CDC, than COVID. And 10 times more died of suicides, and that's with suicide numbers always 6 months in arrears, so it's probably 15 times higher. Because we know that suicides rose last year. So again, it's like what number works? College kids, they'll talk about Alabama having their national championship celebration thing after that, and oh my God, we're going to see a big rise, and we saw nothing. It doesn't. The virus comes in. It's got a 4 to 6 week window of infecting, prompting some hospitalizations and some deaths, and it goes. And that's how every one of these things looks. That's what the Spanish flu curves look like. The Hong Kong and Asian flus, it's what COVID looks like. So the more prudent thing to have done was keep all the hospitals open, let everybody get treated. When it starts to rise, you can get everybody out of there. But keeping hospitals, healthy people out of hospitals, when the hospitals are freaking empty and going broke and they need CARES money bailout, we just have the stupidest leaders ever.
Yeah, that's insanity. You clearly are swinging with a very heavy fist. Michael, what the person driving alone in their car with the mask is probably not likely taking the critical approach to this pandemic as you have. What got you questioning these lockdown measures? Where did it stem from, Michael? What led you down this road?
Right. So it was the cruise ships. I was following them like. It was all over the news. The second cruise ship porting into Oakland, the Grand. I've been on one cruise in my life. It was on the Grand Princess, the same ship that was quarantined off of San Francisco. And when it was ported in, it was really covered on the news like it was the Bronco chase. And then everybody disembarked, and nothing happened. And I just thought that was odd, right? For all the hype that it had got, Wuhan had locked down. It was, a big story. And then 10 days later, the Imperial College released their 2.2 million American death model. And so common sense-wise, I thought more should have happened on these cruise ships. Do nothing scenario. It's like a little incubator. Everybody was in close contact, food and mingling and things like that. And so I took the model inputs, I mentioned this early on in our discussion, and applied them, the model assumptions, applied them to the demographics on the cruise ships. And again, we should have had 155 people die on the cruise ships, and we had 10. And so when we hit 40 million people unemployed, that was what prompted me to start writing, really doing some hardcore research and write the book.
Was this simply an overreaction, do you think, in regards to, hey, public, you need to defend yourself from this type of thing, let's get everything locking down, no restaurants? Was this an overreaction to help protect people, or do you think there was something underwriting that may not be disclosed?
Look, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. My feeling is that we lacked some critical thinking, and so we had Italy was clearly having a very difficult time before we locked down. What nobody really seemed to pay attention to, again, critical thinking, is their nursing homes got ravaged, right? And so the median age was, a little higher than ours. It was hovering around 80, right, with a lot of really frail people, and COVID just wiped it, was really devastating to care facilities, particularly in northern Italy. And I think that everybody got afraid. And so once, we sort of threw out science, Ian. Like I'm writing a second book now. It's coming out this summer, and I was doing a lot of analysis on this before. What did the WHO and the CDC talk about pandemic planning before this? And so what I've come up with is there's sort of science BC before COVID, and there's science AC after COVID. And so we sort of science AC. We threw on a lot of fundamental things, including, hey, if you're going to lock down schools. You might lock them down for 4 weeks when your little community gets hit. Even I wouldn't think that was an off-the-rails idea. And I don't even know that all the decisions made in March were terrible. They lacked critical thinking, but they were out of an abundance of caution. But I tell you, by the time summer hit, and we knew no kids had died really of COVID, after 150,000 adults had, and we kept kids out of school, we lost all critical thinking. I mean, it's just completely off the rails. So why do you write a book like this? It's so it gets documented. I don't know how history will remember this, but I can't imagine they don't view the lockdowns as the single worst public policy in American history after slavery. And it will never get to slavery, right? Nothing could. That was just. But after that, these lockdowns nothing will touch them in American history.
I love it. You've done some great work here, ladies and gentlemen. Author of COVID-19 Lockdowns on Trial, Michael Betrus. Michael, keep up the great work, and look forward to inviting you back on the program in the future.
I would love that. Thank you so much, Ian.
So there you hear it. Look, I don't know much about what Michael has done. Okay, he's clearly a business mind, and he is very well researched. Look, when you go through this book, as I have, he throws out incredibly compelling evidence that shows exactly what he has basically just said, is that there has been a massive overreaction to dealing with a fairly benign virus to a healthy immune system. And this has been a record of repeat now for 1.5 years, going on 2 years, folks. Yet we have a political role model, per se, okay, in the White House that even after being vaccinated, as I mentioned on the show, continues to wear not only one mask, but 2 masks. Is he being paid to do that? I mean, what human being that's balanced and critical in their thinking would do that? Okay, fine. So, hey, Ian, the man's in his 70s, late 70s at that. Perhaps he's overreacting because his immune system is weakened due to age. Okay, fine, I take that. But still, two masks, Perhaps it's a bit excessive. I don't know. Look, that's what we can do, right? We can compare and we can contrast. We can analyze, we can overanalyze, we can underanalyze. But long and short of it here is I would have to agree with Michael here. There has been a massive overreaction to how to deal with this coronavirus. Again, that's based off of my experience in 2016, having been exposed to the Zika virus. And just the background on that, I was incredibly paranoid, if you will, about contracting the Zika virus. I'd been bit by a mosquito, I was freaking out. I thought, oh my goodness, I've got the Zika virus. Well, a good friend of mine who happened to be gay and Jewish, living in South Beach, my best friend, and he said, hey, Ian, come down to this city hall meeting, there's a town argument. And as I'm listening to both sides with the CDC and the local mayor, Philip Levine, I says, this isn't adding up. This just isn't adding up. You got people saying that the Zika virus doesn't cause anything more than flu-like symptoms, but yet the pesticide is causing the same thing. And then there's an argument to spray a less aggressive pesticide, organic, and compound, and the mayor of Miami-Dade is saying no. A different guy than Levine is saying no, we're going to spray what Rick Scott is telling us to spray. But yet Broward to the north is receiving something different. And I simply just started looking in. I just started looking into this controversy, and then one thing led to another, and lo and behold, somehow it was led to a speech that was delivered in 1972 by a Stanford fellow, a Hoover Institute, Dr. Sutton, Anthony Sutton. And a couple of weeks ago, I hosted Patrick Wood, who actually co-authored a book with Sutton in his later years. And what Sutton had done was exposed the very deep and very corrupt veins of the banking institution that runs the federal government in the United States. I'll leave it at that. You can investigate further for yourself. But I leave it. I take it one step further and I say I leave it at this. Just as Michael has done here with his book. As Americans, more than any other country on the planet, as Americans, we have the right to question everything, everyone, and any type of authority. Folks, do everything that you possibly can within your days and your time to exercise that right. And until next hour, I'll be back with Paul Preston, who is aggressively forming a new state for the Union, to join the Union. Be awesome.